Good evening and welcome to the Commonwealth Club. You can find the club on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and the club's website, commonwealthclub.org. I'm Richard Pivnica, Honorary Consul General of the Czech Republic in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, former member of the board of the Commonwealth Club, currently on the advisory board, and your chair for this evening's program. This program is part of the club's Goodlit series underwritten by Bernard Osher Foundation. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, Norman Eisen, former U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic, former Special Counsel to President Obama for Ethics and Government Reform, and the author of the new book, The Last Palace, Europe's Turbulent Century in 5 Lives and 1 Legendary House. Ambassador Eisen is currently a fellow in the governance studies at the Brookings Institution. He's currently a consultant to the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives and the founder and former chair of the government watchdog group, CREW. While he served as ethics counsel to President Obama from 2009 to 2011, the press dubbed him Mr. No, and the ethics czar. He's known as a tough anti-corruption person. Following his service in the White House, he served as U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic and deepened economic ties between the two nations. Before government service, Ambassador Eisen was an attorney specializing in litigation and investigations. His cases include Enron, the subprime financial collapse, the Monica Lewinsky matter, and the 2000 and 2004 presidential recounts. He was named one of the top lawyers by the Washingtonian magazine. Sounds like it could be another book. When Norm Eisen moved to the U.S. ambassador's residence in Prague and returned to the land his mother had fled after the Holocaust, he was startled to discover swastikas hidden beneath the furniture in his new home. But more about that later. In his new book, Ambassador Eisen tells the captivating tale of the upheavals that transformed Europe over the past century and of 4 remarkable people who have called the ambassador's residence home, including Ambassador Shirley Temple Black, who many of you may have known. She was the club past president of the Board of Governors. You're about to hear a conversation about history, diplomacy, and the triumph of democracy in the face of tragedy and dictatorship. I'm sure there will also be some talk about politics, perhaps. We're pleased that Ambassador Eisen will be in conversation with Stephen Sam, editor of the Santa Clara magazine, and perhaps more relevant for tonight, my attaché at the Czech consulate. Stephen has worked in Czech higher education and with the country's leading educational foundation. And along with Senator Bob Dole, he took part in the Pilsen talks held annually to mark the liberation of that city by General Patton's troops. Stephen was the editor of the Commonwealth Club book, Each a Mighty Voice. It's a compilation of the most memorable speeches at the club during the club's first 100 years. Mr. Ambassador, I hope you are in the next edition. Please welcome Ambassador Norman Eisen and Stephen Sam.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you,
That was
Richard.
A beautiful introduction. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, welcome, Norman Eisen, or as we say in Czech, vítáme vás, right?
Děkuju vám moc krát, pane Stevene. I have no idea what that actually is.
So thank you for joining us here this evening in San Francisco. You've written a remarkable book here, The Last Palace, right? As Richard noted in the introduction, you kind of captured a whole century in the lives that you tell the story through. How did you come to write the book in this way? How did you come up with this structure?
A marvelous question. Will you indulge me if I just say a few thank yous before I
Absolutely.
describe the torment that led to the structure of this book? I want to thank George for his rousing introduction, which echoed in the little waiting area back there, the introduction to the introduction, I should say. And I must thank the Pivnikas, Richard, of course, as you heard, the Consul General of the Czechs. We have his attaché on stage with me, but also Barbara, who is the Consul General of the Slovaks. So they unwind the so-called velvet divorce when they have breakfast every morning. Just down the block from the home of Ambassador Shirley Temple Black. Somewhere here are Charlie Black, her son, and Susan Black, her daughter. They've become my adoptive family. There's Charlie, there's Susan. They've very kindly adopted me in the course of writing this book, and they welcomed me as always, like everybody in my family. Their objective in life, they think I'm too lean, so I always get a good meal when I come and visit Cousin Charlie and Cousin Susan. And it's such an honor, finally, I'll say, Steve and all, to be here to speak at the Commonwealth Club. When I told people I was coming to San Francisco to speak, everybody asked me in kind of hushed tones, "Oh, are you going to the Commonwealth Club?" Made me feel very good to say yes. And in particular, because, and this brings me to your question, Steve, in particular because of this club's connections to the Czech and Slovak lands that I write about in The Last Palace, published to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the founding of Czechoslovakia in 1918, and really telling a 100-year tale. The prism of Czechoslovakia is one through which the story of Europe and really of transatlantic relationships, the European-American ties over the past century, can be viewed, I think, through the windows of that house. It's not just that one of the first women presidents of the Commonwealth Club Board of Directors was Ambassador Black, but so many distinguished Czechs who appear in the book, from Jan Masaryk to President Havel to President Klaus. All of them have been here, all show up in The Last Palace. So what a treat to be here with all of you. And now to your very good question. When I left the ambassadorship, as an ex-ambassador, it's a big month for ambassadors at the Commonwealth Club. I'd like to come back and hear that Korean bilateral conversation. When I left the ambassadorship and went to Brookings, I intended to write a book about the story, the ebbs and flows of liberal democracy in Europe over the past 100 years. And I started to write that book as a weighty scholarly tome. And I found that I couldn't even bear to write it. And who would want to read it? I thought. So I really racked my brain. Brookings, our wonderful past president, Strobe Talbot, my current boss, John Allen, they've been so marvelously supportive of me and of the book. And I really racked my brain to write something that could tell that tale but bring it to life. Mm-hmm. And I was having lunch with another former ambassador complaining, Ambassador Dennis Ross, one of our great bipartisan, he's worked for both administrations, peacemakers. And I was complaining to Ambassador Ross that I couldn't quite find the way to tell this story. And in the course of kvetching, some people say they do their best thinking in the shower. The Jewish people do their best thinking while kvetching, while complaining. And in the course of complaining, it just fell into place. Why don't I tell the story of the century through the people who lived in the house and through the house itself? So that enabled me to start with the builder of the house, Otto Petschek. He exemplified the hope and the exuberance of the new country of Czechoslovakia, the richest man in the country, and a great fan of America, of the new transatlantic relationship, Wilsonian democracy, and he built that house as a tribute, right down to modeling elements of the home on the Versailles and the Petit Trianon, where the treaties bringing World War I to an end were formed, and his struggle to build the house, soon joined by the struggle of dealing with the Depression and the rise of fascism. I thought, oh, it's a wonderful first chapter. And then the next 3 chapters, the next character to tell the story of World War II, Rudolf Toussaint, the cultured, cultivated, complicated, conflicted German general who thought, he believed that Germany, he was no fan of Hitler's, although Hitler was very fond of him. I write about some of the excruciating lunches to which Hitler subjected him. But he thought if he stayed in, he could make things better. He was no model liberal. He was a conservative German, old German army man. And his conscience was consumed step by step, even as he tried to resist, and tells the story of how it's impossible to be a part of such a regime and save your soul. But he, like Otto Petschek, struggled to build this house, symbolizing the struggle for liberal democracy. I argue that Toussaint was transformed, and he has a great opportunity at the end of the war to redeem himself, to save the house from destruction, to save the city of Prague and the people in Prague from a devastating, totally unknown story in the West. And that's his moment, his chance for redemption. You'll have to read the book to see how it turns out. Obviously, I lived in the house, so that ought to be a clue to you. The next character was the third of the great characters to tell the story of America's failure. And one of the stories in the book is the America's engagement and then withdrawal from alliances. Ambassador Lawrence Steinhardt, post-war ambassador, came to Prague to save Prague from communist takeover, and he fell in love with the house. And I tell the story of that, his passionate affair with Czech democracy, his quixotic efforts to get this house into the safekeeping of America, and his love affair with a Czech princess who happened to be married, and so was he. And their respective husband and wife also became extremely fond of each other. So you'll read about that. There's some love interest in that story, and his efforts, symbolizing the effort to save Europe, his effort to save the house. The fourth character, of course, a revelation. Probably many in the room knew her. Some even called her mom. The fourth character, this was one of the happiest coincidences. I was thinking, how will I write about such a span of time? I have to capture the next big event in history after the communist takeover, the Prague Spring of 1968, and the Velvet Revolution of 1989. And by very fortunate happenstance, Shirley Temple Black was in Prague and in that house on the day that the Soviets invaded to crush the Prague Spring in 1968. She vowed to return as ambassador and help bring communism to an end. And of course, she does that in 1989, a story that is too little known, her wonderful ambassadorizing. She's the fourth character. And then the fifth and final character is my mother. If Otto Petschek, who I told you about, was the wealthiest Czechoslovak Jew, my mother was the poorest Czechoslovak Jew. She grew up in a tiny house crammed with books. Her father was the shtetl, the village rabbi, far, far from Prague. And I weave my mother's tale in. You get 3 chapters of each of these 4 others, and my mother's tale of growing up in the country, surviving the Holocaust, returning to rebuild her life. and then ultimately sending her son back with great trepidation, warning me that I would discover all of the same forces were afoot. And I poo-pooed her, only to find out, as you'll read in the book, that I was too quick to dismiss my mom's painfully acquired knowledge of history, and that guided by her as my best advisor, I take on today's ghosts of illiberalism, and she and I have a great adventure together in the last chapter of the book. So that's the story of the book, and how I think through these human lives it tells the story of this past century.
Well, there's one wonderful moment where you describe not quite an argument, a disagreement with your mother about the significance of finding, as Richard mentioned in the introduction, finding swastikas underneath some of the furniture there in the house.
Yes.
So what are the two lessons that the two of you take away from that?
Well, my mother and I took two different lessons away from the discovery of the swastikas. I thought it was a marvelous turn of history that here I, the child of a Czech Holocaust survivor, am living in a house that was occupied seized by the same regime that deported my mother and her family to Auschwitz in cattle cars. And that this, as President Obama, when he invited me to take the job, said, what a marvelous turn of history. It's an only in America story. So I thought that was the lesson. And when I discovered the swastikas, I was, of course, I had a little chill of horror, but I was mostly amazed by the fact that there had been this turn of history. To my mother, Steve, the swastikas symbolized something very different. To my mother, they represented the reason I start the book as I'm preparing to go to Prague, and I describe my mom's reluctance, conversations. I call her from Air Force One, and I eventually brought her around. Then I call her to tell her about these swastikas. And to her, those swastikas represented the ineradicable weight of history and the inability, no matter how you might try, to escape the horrors of the past, and a warning sign that illiberalism, hate, intolerance would never go away, that they're always there lurking under the table. And you'll have to read the book, and in particular the last part of the book, to see who was right, me or my mom, based on my experiences with her as my diplomatic advisor.
Well, I think it's fair to say, right, that that's a story, and what lessons we might take away or who's right might also depend on where we stop the narrative, right? Where does the cycle turn it?
So true. But since I wrote the book, I got to pick where to stop the narrative. Some of my mother's friends, still quibble with me about my authorial choices in that regard. As you can see, I am an inveterate optimist. And it's now an optimism tempered by experience. But I will say that I'm not the first American to make this mistake. I rushed in to Prague where angels feared to tread. And I was your Commonwealth Club speaker. Is he included in the 100 speeches, Havel?
Havel? Yeah, absolutely.
He made
yes.
it. Woo, Richard, I've got tough competition for volume 2. Maybe I got to filibuster some more, so there's good material for Steve. So my mom warned me that she presciently, more so than my official United States government briefers, warned me that the ghosts of history were once again stirring in Europe. Intolerance, hostility to liberal democracies, the values diversity, of pluralism, and above all, the extremes of the right and of the left, anti-Semitism, and the Russian bear was stirring, which had driven her from the country in 1949. And I poo-pooed her because I'd been there with President Obama. I'd seen his rapturous welcome. I was there when he signed the New START treaty with President Medvedev. And so I arrive, and my fellow Commonwealth Club guest, President Havel, there's been a marked decline if you trace those Jan Masaryk, President Havel, down to me. But President Havel and I got to chatting we met at a party I described. He was the surprise guest at this party. I described the party, and he warned me of what was going on in the same words, virtually word for word, as my mother. And I had to call her that night. I talked to her every day. I practiced my lamentable Czech with her. And I had to tell her, Maminka, you were right. You were right. President Havel agrees with you. Maybe I need to rethink the situation. And then, of course, you'll read about all the stuff that happened and how I almost got run out of the country. But I survived to tell the tale.
Well, Havel also gave you some interesting advice.
Yes. President Havel, I was the last United States ambassador who had the privilege to be taken under President Havel's wing. And you'll read about how he came to meet me for 15 minutes, and we ended up, the Israeli ambassador hosted a get-together, and I was very tired, and I tried to call the Israeli Yaakov Levy and beg off this surprise cocktail. He says, we've invited a special guest. He'll be so disappointed. No, you can't come. You can't not come. So I showed up, and President Havel came purportedly for 15 minutes to check out this new American diplomat. And after we'd been chatting for 14 minutes, he leaned over to Yaakov, the Israeli. He said, Yaakov, in that heavy smoker's voice, Yaakov, have you got any champagne? And he ended up bringing the champagne. We talked for 2 hours. And at the end of that conversation, I saw him to the door. We would have many other conversations. He said to me, Norman, I said, Mr. President, what advice do you have for me in my new job? I mean, what a thrill to meet this incredible hero, one of the greatest heroes of the 20th century, not just of Central Europe, but really of democracy. And the story of the book is the story of the resilience of democracy despite the intense attacks. So I asked him for one last lesson. I said, Mr. President, what advice do you have for me? He said, Norman, you must be a very undiplomatic diplomat. And you'll see how that advice played out over the course of my first year in Prague.
So we can come back to your mother for a moment, I think, because you talked some about her. Can you talk about a little bit more about where she was from? Because I think you mentioned Barbara Pivnica, right, being the honorary consul general from the Slovak Republic. About that shtetl where she was
Yes. So Czechoslovakia, of course, was born. Jan Masaryk's father, Tomáš Masaryk, cooked up the country, 2 professors, him and President Wilson. And it was a combination of the Czech lands, the historic Czech lands of Bohemia and Moravia, with the Slovak lands, sister Slavic nations within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, put together in the reordering after World War I. And my mother was from the easternmost part of that country of Czechoslovakia, from what is now Slovakia, a tiny shtetl, a tiny village of Sobranca, which now is in Slovakia, right near the border with Ukraine. And my mother lived there until she was sent to the ghetto in 1944. They kind of forgot that there were Jews left in that part of the country. If they'd been able to hang on a little longer, they would have avoided the concentration camps. And it was a very idyllic small town. Her father was the town's all-purpose Jewish officiant. He was a rabbi. He was a shochet, a ritual slaughterer. He was a sofer, a scribe. He would write the Jewish documents, the wedding contracts, the Torahs, and he was a moel. He did the circumcisions. So all sharp instruments were his specialty, pens, knives, and his brain was the sharpest of all. And he raised my mother very atypically. It was 8 children, very large Jewish household. But he raised my mother very atypically. All the girls in his house, he was 4 daughters in. My mom was the baby. 4 daughters in, my grandfather, Zalman Leib. 4 daughters in before he had his first son. He had 2 sons and 6 girls. And so he had very brilliant daughters, and he taught his daughters Jewish law, the Talmud, the Bible. My mom could not go out and play on the Sabbath. Extremely Orthodox family. She could not go out and play after lunch until she had studied her Jewish texts with her father. So it was a somewhat unusual house. The daughters, I write about them. My mom's sister was a feminist, a Zionist. My grandfather, very anti-Zionist. There should be no Jewish state in Israel, then Palestine, until the Messiah comes. And his oldest daughter, my aunt, had a completely different view. And my mom was a very brilliant student. And the first of these transition chapters that I write about her tells the story of how the schoolmaster comes to ask my grandfather if my mother can go to gymnasium, to college preparatory school, because my grandfather had wanted some education, junior high school level education, for each of his daughters. And the struggle between the ancient and the modern, and between this the old world of Europe and the new transatlantic world of modernism that story symbolizes.
So one of the things that's fascinating about the book, and the fact that you're telling your story about a palace and through the people, you get a real sense of the physicality of history and the importance of that. Did you have a sense of that before you went to Prague as ambassador? I mean, how history resides there in the way that it does?
This is so much better than just me standing up here and talking. Steve's questions are wonderful. Would you hand me your book for a minute? I felt can I have the gavel too? I felt very good in the green room when I saw all the little Post-its. It made me, as an author, feel so good, and particularly because I use these same, it's an old litigator's trick, I use the same tiny Post-its because the larger ones don't let you particularize quite as much. I do believe in the physicality of history, and part of that moment that I had where I realized that I wanted to tell the story this way was the 6th character in the book, which is this magnificent house. There are a number of you here tonight who've been to the house, and it in itself is a marvelous hybrid, totally idiosyncratic, that Otto Petschek built and tore down, again symbolizing this effort to build democracy, to build transatlantic democracy. He built and tore it down. It took him 20 times as long to build this house, 150 room plus house on acres of gardens and wonderful features in the compound, city block with a couple little, basically a city block compound. And it took him 20 times as long to build the house as it did the Empire State Building. He taught himself, as it did the builders of the Empire State Building, which is roughly contemporaneous in the 20s and the 30s. He taught himself architecture by building and tearing down this house. And it was, for me, deeply symbolic, not only of the effort to our yearning to build a more perfect democracy, but of the European-American combination of transatlantic democracy that really was created through Wilson's intervention in World War I. And it ushered in a new era. I debate with my Brookings colleague. I had my wonderful Brookings colleague, Bob Kagan, released a book, The Jungle Grows Back, about this same cycle, although he and I have some different ideas. He's also a historian in part by training. He and I have some different ideas about this century-long cycle, and my colleague Bill Galston came and gave an afterword at this event. And so the house physicalizes, it embodies, that's the word I'm looking for, it embodies not just the ideas of democracy that Otto Petschek had. He kept a copy of the League of Nations Charter, a pocket-sized copy, with him at all times. They're still in the house. Everything is there. It would be hard to write this book if you didn't live in this house. Miraculously, there's so many artifacts that are still there. But it also embodies the European-American marriage. I found in the basement when I was exploring the house, and I kept finding rooms until the day I left. I went looking for my daughter's lost bicycle, and I found 3 rooms I'd never seen before my last week in the house while we were packing. It's also the marriage of European and American ideas. From some angles, it looks like a French, a neo-Baroque, Beaux-Arts house. In other ways, it's startlingly modern and American. I found the first printed set of Frank Lloyd Wright blueprints from the 1920s, before he was very well known, heavily annotated in the basement of the house. And the house has one of Frank Lloyd Wright's signature modern features, a floating wall. Wright had the idea that you should break down the separation between inside and out, the most fundamental separation in architecture. So and there's another very famous house, the Villa Tugendhat
In Brno.
In Brno, the great Mies van der Rohe's first great house, also before he was known, has a floating wall. Otto Petschek invented the first Czech floating wall 3 years before Mies. So he was a very, very brilliant innovator who also embodied this European American, and particularly European Central American, a marriage of policy and hopes and dreams in the 20th century.
Now, am I...
Oh, I didn't answer your part. Did I know this before? No. I couldn't even pronounce Mies van der Rohe's name before I went to Prague.
Now, am I remembering right that before you moved to this palace, you lived in apartments up until...
Yes, my entire life was spent in apartments before moving into this house, which was a great amusement to my mother, who liked to tell her Czechoslovak friends, my son is moving into Otto Petschek's home, and it is his starter house.
So we've got some questions here from the audience. I'd like to make sure we have the chance to ask them, right? Since you yourself have served as an ambassador, what's your advice to a new generation of diplomats?
Oh, to a new generation of diplomats, we need you more than ever. Please, please come into international relations. You will find there's no more important profession. The transatlantic relationship requires tremendous attention. It will require some rejuvenation. And in that sense, though, I would not only limit my comments to those who, since the question is about a new generation of diplomats, I won't only point to those of us who have official titles as ambassador, consuls general, attachés, but every person in this room is an ambassador for the United States. You live here in San Francisco, one of the most visited cities in the entire world. And whenever you meet somebody from another country, you represent America. You are the face of America. So that's a chance for you to be a diplomat. When you travel, that's a chance for you to be a diplomat. And I think in the way we conduct ourselves as a country, one of the great lessons of the book, the great redeeming force of democracy, is that ultimately in democracies, there is a channel for the expression of the energy, the wisdom, the compassion, and the activity of the people. And I think there's a great need for every American, as well as people applying, taking the State Department Foreign Service exam and participating in all the ways I've described. There's a need for every American to revive American diplomacy.
So let me play devil's advocate for a moment, right? As someone who's lived and worked in the Czech lands, I know how I feel about this. But why should Americans care about this little country in the heart of Europe?
I quote as an epigram to one of the chapters Otto von Bismarck's statement that he who controls Prague controls Europe. And the Prague, the Czech lands, the Slovak lands, are described as Central Europe because they are smack dab in the middle of the continent. And that is why they have been the subject of a tug of war between West and East. That's another part of the book. Otto Petschek looking to the West to anchor his vision of this house. And the tug of war between Western democracy and Eastern totalitarianism over the past century, and the resurgent totalitarianism that we see emanating now across Central and Eastern Europe. And the Czechs are, I'm sorry that the Czechs have to be the canary in the coal mine of democracy. But the Czechs and Slovaks have occupied that role for the past 100 years. They are the bellwether. I've just written a new Brookings report in which I covered the Czech and Slovak nations, and my colleagues wrote about Poland and Hungary and the general fate, how democracy is faring in Europe. I write in that report that I'm encouraged because despite challenges, some of these totalitarian leanings that I describe, democracy is vibrant, it's strong in Prague, in Bratislava, and that's a good sign for the continent. So if you care about Europe, you should care about the Czech lands. And since Wilson's marriage of America to the European continent in the end of World War I and its aftermath, America is inevitably drawn in. There is no avoiding European conflict. It's not just World War I, it's World War II, it's the long struggle of the Cold War. You would have thought we'd learned our lesson from having taken our eye off the ball after World War I, having done it again after World War II. I tell the untold story of how the coup, the communist coup of 1948 in Prague was foreordained by decisions that were made in 1945, and some surprising, very famous, the story is not known, very famous Americans who doomed the Czech lands to 40 years of communist domination. And with that, the Cold War is thought to have begun with the fall of Prague in 48. America's drawn back in, and yet we took our eye off the ball again, Steve. After 1989, we assumed it would be fine. We didn't do another Marshall Plan, and we've seen what's happened because of we're not solely to blame, and we had some successes in that post-Cold War era, notably in Germany. But we see now the wobbly nature of the fragile nature of democracy and how hard you have to work. So let us not make that mistake again in the future. That's one of the arguments that I make in the book, but I try to make it in very lively fashion.
So some of the folks quite naturally also have some questions related to ethics and government here at home. Understanding that you probably can't talk about the inner workings of the House Judiciary Committee.
I'll warn you, let me see those questions.
Let's start right with that one.
So I'm going to apologize to all of you. This is my first book talk post. You know I love nothing better than to answer questions like, hey, Mr. No, whatever happened to ethics and government reform? If you've seen me on television, I was until recently a CNN commentator and frequent columnist. You know I enjoy doing it, especially when I get paid to do it. That makes it even more enjoyable. But since taking my new role as consultant for the House Judiciary Committee, I'm no longer able to answer this very interesting question. Fortunately, if you must know the answer to the question, hey, Mr. No, whatever happened to ethics and government reform, you'll find a rich repository of video clips and editorial columns residing on the internet. But I must demur on all domestic questions out of an abundance of caution, and as you can appreciate, not to do anything that would comment on my current role. I tried to make that as charming as possible.
Well, one of the questions that came in over Twitter has to do with the silver screen and your role.
Oh, that's more like it.
And your role in inspiring a character in Grand Budapest Hotel.
Yes, that is a wonderful story and also relates to that last card. When it is such a it's such a privilege to be an ambassador, and particularly for me as a child of immigrant parents, my father from Poland, my mother from Czechoslovakia. My parents had a very modest small business, a hamburger stand in South Los Angeles. I found that I have really constantly pinched myself in this incredible opportunity that America affords to someone like me as the doors are opened. It's a terrible struggle, of course, for the migrants who come here, but for their children, all opportunities are open. But none is as fun as being ambassador. It was pretty fun when my law school classmate Barack Obama called me and said, I'm going to run for president, Norm. I'm going to run for president. Won't you help out? I went home and I told Lindsay, no chance whatsoever. Hillary's going to, she's got this race locked up. And Lindsay said, oh, no, he's going to win, proving my wife is a much smarter prognosticator. This was at the end of 2006. And she said, I hope you didn't turn him down. I said, no, he's my friend. Of course I'm going to help him. And it was wonderful to be on a presidential campaign, to travel with the president, to work in the White House. But being ambassador is best of all. And part of the wonder of that is people just pop up. The most interesting people just pop up. And, when you're ambassador, you're an honorary member of the Famous Persons Club. I didn't even know it existed. They all seem to know each other. And they just call you up. And so somebody called me and said, Wes Anderson is coming, the head of a studio who I'd met on the Obama campaign. Wes Anderson is coming to Prague. Would you like to meet him? And we're big Wes Anderson fans in my house. I'd love to meet him. I hit it off with Wes. I showed him around town. He was working on a movie set in part in Prague about the interwar years. And we got to be friends. He came back. He stayed with me a second time. And then I got a call. He went off to write the script. And I got a call. Norm, Jeff Goldblum is coming to see you. It's a rule of the Famous Persons Club. Your home is always open to the other members, whether you want it to be or not. By the way, ambassadors are only honorary members. We're expelled. We're expelled from the club as soon as you're no longer ambassador.
Former famous person.
I probably violated a rule of the club by admitting that it exists. Wes has stayed. I correspond with and see him and Juman. So he's stayed friends, and so has Jeff Goldblum. So he says, Jeff Goldblum is coming to see you. I said, Wes, that's wonderful, but why is Jeff Goldblum coming to see me? He says, because he's playing you in the movie. So Jeff Goldblum, who's still a very true and dear friend, I just spoke at the unveiling of his star on the Walk of Fame. In Washington, D.C., ambassadors are a dime a dozen. Your cab driver or your dry cleaner probably was an ambassador from somewhere. But in L.A., they're a little more unusual. So he invited me to speak, and he did the talking book, the recorded book of The Last Palace, kindly. So he came to see me, and it turns out that Wes had written a crusading lawyer into the movie to be played by Jeff, and there's a scene where he stands up to the fascists, and he's the ethics czar of the film. And I had a wonderful time with Jeff, who, as I said, also became a friend. And he stayed with me. He trailed me to observe my mannerisms. I had a beard at the time. He grew a very similar beard. He even wore one of my suits. He said, oh, can I borrow that jacket just to get into the role, Norm? So that's how I came to be a part of that very wonderful movie, and really one of the most magical. There's so many marvelous moments, and I felt like in a little tiny way, because one of the predecessors who I most admired was Ambassador Black, that in my own little tiny way, I saw what she so loved about the entertainment industry. Really one of the most of those magical times. I was invited to come to the Berlinale, the Berlin Film Festival, and walk the red carpet with the stars of the film. When it premiered, it had its premiere. I hadn't seen it. He sent me the script so I could see what it's about. But to see it, and of course, as soon as I saw, oh, this is Wes Anderson's masterpiece. And then the next night was the Prague premiere. And really, for me and for Lindsay, it was such a thrill to welcome the cast and crew came, and all the actors, and Bill Murray and Jeff, and that really was one of the most. And we had the party, of course, in the Last Palace. So it was a wonderful thing. And I encourage you all, I'll give you a little challenge. Go watch Isle of Dogs and see if you can find the ethics czar reference. It's in that movie too. So anybody, is there anybody here who knows where it is? Free book, if anybody can say. Yes, where is it? Where is it? You've got to do better. You only get a free dust jacket for that. It's close enough. At the very end, there's a character, and the title flashes. They give little names to each of the characters at the end of the movie, and this character is described as the ethics czar. She's a somewhat heroic but annoying character, which I think captures the essence of ethics czardom very nicely.
So you mentioned Ambassador Black again just now. And one of the wonderful details that you note in the book is when she would head out wearing a baseball cap with her initials on that.
Yes.
And for Czechs, those initials meant something very particular.
The initials, which her initials were STB, Shirley Temple Black. And those are the same initials as her next door neighbor, just across the road from her, just across Zygmunta Wintra, which I helped rename after another great Californian, Ronald Reagan. It's now known as Ronald Reagan Road. The next door neighbor is the Sztatni Bezpieczność Policja, the state security police, the dreaded STB. And so the Czechs love this, that she was mocking the security police with the use of her cap, and she even wore it sometimes to observe demonstrations, because she wanted to be noticed. This was part of the brilliance. You'll read about it in the book. She really was a brilliant, brilliant diplomat. She wanted to be noticed because it meant the police, the STB, would be less vicious with the protesters. So she made it a point to be that. She had a wonderful, dark sense of humor, which perfectly fits with the Czech ethos. And which, as you'll read, I attempted to channel in my ambassadorizing.
So one of
Notice they give you two glasses
of water in case you're
must be planning on a very long evening.
Well, of course, Shirley Temple Black. She spoke here right after she came back from Prague in '68. I remember seeing "I saw Soviet tanks in Prague" was kind of how the speech was dubbed. So you capture that moment. You capture '68. You capture '89. I'm also wondering, with your own work as ambassador, right, that you emphasized working together, kind of collaboration, right, versus unilateralism.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
And my philosophy of diplomacy and of life is that is one of reciprocity. So I believe the brilliance of America in the past century, starting with the Wilsonian moment, when we rise to our finest moments, is that we exemplify a philosophy of generosity. And I found as ambassador that the Czechs were very, very willing to listen favorably to the things that were important to us as the United States. For example, they were the only European ally to do a troop increase in Afghanistan as part of the mission. My first year there, we almost doubled bilateral trade over my ambassadorial tenure, many times the average for U.S. embassies in Europe. The reason was because they knew that I was working just as hard to advance Czech interests in the United States. They wanted more foreign direct investment. I frequently traveled to the United States with Czech delegations to look for business opportunities, reciprocal ones, on the theory that that would create jobs in both places and that America would end up better off through a philosophy of reciprocity. I do think that is a lesson that Ambassador Black understood. You see that in the book because she has the opportunity to put herself, because of her worldwide fame, the fact that she's in Prague in the midst of this Velvet Revolution, the fall of communism, she really could have put herself first in the spotlight, made herself a part of the story. She told her embassy officers that a movie can only have one star, and that the star of this one needed to be the Czechs, and that they would be the supporting cast. So she was she and her team were the best supporting actors. So, there's a sense of that balance of relationships. I do have to say that the story that I tell, as wonderful as it is just the tip of the iceberg. And as you'll read in the book, there is a forthcoming second volume of Ambassador Black's brilliant autobiography. Many of you probably read Child Star, considered to be, it's not only me saying this, I'm biased, but considered by scholars and aficionados to be one of the greatest show business autobiographies ever written. I know a little bit about the forthcoming second volume, and it is even more brilliant and fascinating than Child Star. So you'll read much more about how this philosophy of reciprocity, of generosity, of tolerance, of listening, of understanding people characterized Ambassador Black's rich government career, made her so celebrated as ambassador to Ghana, as protocol chief, how it revolutionized the Foreign Service as she trained all new ambassadors for many years, and the culmination of that in her incredible tenure in Prague. I only write about a few weeks of that tenure. She really helped that country flourish. So you'll want to keep an eye for that book talk coming to a Commonwealth club near you soon.
Well, you mentioned earlier how much of the palace interior survived, right? The objects in the house survived. And you just now mentioned the importance of a supporting role. There's one character in particular who plays a very interesting supporting role throughout decades.
Corny.
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Pokorny, one of the most fascinating characters in the book is Otto Petchek's butler, Mr. Pokorny, and the two of them developed a symbiotic relationship. And he continued. He started with Otto in the 1920s, and he was still serving in that house during the Nazi era, when the Soviets briefly invaded the house, when Ambassador Steinhardt lived there and secured the house for America, through almost a dozen ambassadors, and into the beginnings of the Prague Spring. And so he saw the three great regimes of the 20th century, some great and I believe magnificent, the American transatlantic idea, but also the most great and terrible, Soviet communism and the Nazis. He saw them all pass through the doors of that house, and I felt like I got to know him because and I write about him, I had the modern day reincarnation of Mr. Pokorny, who cared so tenderly for the house, who even persuaded the Nazi occupiers not to get rid of Otto's Jewish artifacts. The Jewish books are still in Otto's library today. I felt like I had the privilege of knowing Pokorny because I had a similar major domo, Mr. Chernik, who was, when people would see the two of us, they probably assumed he was the ambassador. Tall, pigeon-chested, silver-haired, always elegantly attired, and he loved that house, as he once told me. He loved that house like a child. The same was true of Mr. Pokorny. I was so pleased. I got to make Mr. Chernik's dream come true. After working for the United States for decades, he retired, and he had once told me his dream was to come and see how a banquet was served in the White House, how an event, because he had done so many thousands of events for America, and he'd welcomed presidents, prime ministers, so many dignitaries. When I traveled with President Obama had a dinner for all of the European heads of Central and Eastern European heads of state. They all came in, 18 heads of state for dinner in that house. Mr. Chernik wanted to see how an event like that was done in the White House, and he wanted to go behind the scenes and look in the kitchen, see how the cooking, the service, the preparation, the hosting, he wanted to compare it to how we did it in the house. And I was able, after he retired, all the ambassadors got together, and we brought him to Washington, D.C. We put together a trip for him. I took him everywhere, the Pentagon, and he got to go behind the scenes at the White House. It just so happened that that it was for the White House Hanukkah party was that night, so he'd seen me put on fancy Hanukkah parties he could compare. And it just so happened that a rabbi who had visited me in the Czech Republic was also in charge of the keeping kosher in this same Hanukkah party. So Mr. Chernik came back. He said to me, "I see the same rabbi everywhere." That was the first thing he said. And then he told me about the party. I said, "What was it like, Mr. Chernik?" He said, "Well," he sniffed, "well, it was fine, but not as good as our Hanukkah party." That tells you something about the caretakers of this house.
So actually, when your family took up residence there, you held the first Passover Seders, as far as you know, since the Paychecks, right?
Yes, the Passover Seder in the house, I write about it, was very special for me. And it was part of the way I figured out, actually, that my mom and President Havel had a point. It was very special because there had not been, as far as we know, there had not been a Passover Seder in the house since the Petcheks left. And Lindsay and I decided we have a great, vast dining room in that house. You can seat 70 at rounds in that room. It's not that much smaller than this room, slightly more well lit. And so we decided we'd have a Passover Seder. We wanted to do it as a diplomatic dinner. And so we did not just invite Jewish people. We're very ecumenical anyhow. We said we're going to invite, it's a holiday of freedom. And so we'll invite all of the people who work on freedom in the country. So we invited some of our fellow ambassadors who we had partnered with on various projects. We invited human rights activists from the private sector, newspaper and TV, publishers, writers, editors, journalists who exemplify the free press, our friends in the government who worked for various freedoms. and full room. We're having the Seder. And one after another, people came up to me and Lindsay and whispered to us, "Ambassador, how did you know?" I said, "How did I know what?" "How did you know my mother was Jewish?" I had no idea. And as that one leaves, then the next one comes up to me, "Excuse me, Ambassador." "Yes," he says, whispers, "how did you know my dad was Jewish?" And a large number of the people we had invited without knowing turned out to have a Jewish ancestry. And so afterwards, Lindsay and I were comparing notes. And of course, we thought that was delightful. What a wonderful thing. And I called my mother to tell her the story. And my mother said to me, "Oh, you think that's nice?" She says, "Why do they have to keep it a secret?" And again, like with the swastika, she saw that the people were still, these were some of the most powerful people in the country, and they were nervous about publicly identifying their Jewish identities because of the history, because of the cognizance of the history. And I thought, you'll read about how the scales were lifted from my eyes, but that conversation with my mother was a big one where I started to wonder, wait a minute, why don't people want to, as they would in the United States, why don't they want to proclaim their history? I wonder if something's going on.
Well, that seems like a good place for us to wrap up our conversation. So I'd like to say thank you very much, Norm Eisen, former U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic, former special counsel to President Obama for ethics and government reform, and author of the new book, The Last Palace, Europe's Turbulent Century in 5 Lives and 1 Legendary House. We'd also like to thank everyone here in our audience in San Francisco and our audiences on radio, television, and the internet. This program has been part of the club's Good Lit series, underwritten by the Bernard Osher Foundation. And we'd also like to remind everyone that copies of Ambassador Eisen's book are available, and he'll be pleased to sign them outside the room following the program. So with that, I'm Stephen Saum, and this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.